My parents always taught me that anything in excess was bad. It didn't really resonate because I still continue to do things in excess, like constantly, but whatever. So it begs the question, should we cycle on and off of keto? And I think the short answer is yes. It's what I've ultimately been doing for 10 years. But understanding proper ketogenic cycling is very important because there's really two different ways. There's multiple ways, but really two different ways that you see it done. And although I like to believe that there's always a practical application for one thing or another, I really do think that one way is particularly better. Okay, the two ways that you see people carb cycle. They'll either do a ketogenic diet for 3 or 4 days out of the week, and then they'll carb up, and then they'll do keto again for a couple days. So they'll basically be 3 days of keto, 4 days of keto, then 1 or 2 days of carbohydrates, then 3 or 4. They're doing these really short cycles, which does kind of make sense in some ways. If you're looking at it from a glycogen perspective, right? You allow your body a chance to drain glycogen stores, which are carbohydrates stored in your muscles, and then you give yourself a chance to rebuild them. So for performance and stuff, I get it, but you're not really getting benefits of a ketogenic diet, and I'll explain why in a minute. I'm more of a fan of going 2 or 3 months strict ketogenic, and then taking a few weeks off of keto, and then coming back. And the main reason behind it, above all else, is it gives enough time for adaptation and mitochondrial efficiency to occur. Okay, when you first go on a ketogenic diet, when you first switch over, it's a serious oxidative stressor. It really is. It triggers a lot of stress in the body, and part of the process is your body adapting and getting better at dealing with that stress. There's a study that was published in the journal Neurobiology of Disease that looked at just that. Okay, again, I've talked about this study before. It shows that oxidative stressors like hydrogen peroxide elevate right when we start keto, and then over a course of a month or so, it declines as our body adapts to it, meaning our body is getting better at dealing with that stress. That's a really good thing. But there's also evidence that shows that every time you bounce out of keto in a short term, not bounce out like I had an apple and kicked myself out of keto, but really go out and go into a different energy system altogether, well, then you kind of start that process over again. Now, you have a lot of benefits that occur on a ketogenic diet by being consistent with it. Okay, what happens is over time, as our body is exposed to ketones, we get various benefits. It's not all about body composition. The longer our cells are quote unquote marinating in ketones, the more sort of genetic activation we get out of it. One of the biggest benefits of a ketogenic diet is the fact that it allows our genes to be more effective. It's called histone deacetylase inhibition. Another one of the benefits is it allows our cells to get very efficient at utilizing fat as a fuel source. This means that when you do cardio or when you do a workout, your body is more likely to shift over to your fat stores than it is to shift over to your carbohydrate stores. I don't know anybody that doesn't really want that. I want my body to burn fat as much as it possibly can whenever I want it to. That's not going to come unless you get keto adapted and fat adapted. But then where do carbohydrates come into play? Well, if you cycle off of keto every 2 or 3 months and you come into some carbohydrate loading mode there, and good quality carbohydrates, not total garbage, okay, what happens is you allow your body to adapt to that energy system for a little bit of time. You start developing the ability to still handle that glucose. You develop the ability to handle those carbohydrates. It's metabolic flexibility at its finest. You see, there's some evidence that shows that the longer that you're on a ketogenic diet, you actually lose some of the insulin sensitivity. So you lose some of the benefit of reducing your carbohydrate intake. And you occasionally have to remind your body that, oh wait, there are carbohydrates that come in. So that way your body gets efficient at utilizing those carbohydrates again for a little bit, and you switch back over to using ketones again. But let's talk about the oxidative stressor thing for just a minute. You see, the goal isn't to just get to a point where you are good at managing oxidative stress. The goal is to continually stress yourself, but not so much that you wear yourself out. So if you look at studies, you see when someone switches over to a ketogenic diet, it creates some inflammation at first, it creates some oxidative stress, and then the body gets used to dealing with it. But the same kind of thing happens when someone comes off of a ketogenic diet and goes back onto carbohydrates. They have an increase in inflammation, they have an increase in oxidative stressors, and guess what? The body gets better at dealing with it over time. Granted, The body is much better at dealing with it in a ketogenic sense, which is why I'd say the ketogenic style you should have be the lion's share of your cycle. But then the carbohydrate share should be like a shorter 2, 3, 4 week cycle compared to a 2 or 3 month cycle of keto. Gives your body enough time to deal with the stressors, get the ability to kind of combat those and upregulate those processes, just in time for you to switch back to keto, get a little bit of a stressor out of it, and then upregulate ketone production, upregulate those antioxidant capabilities. So how do you carb cycle? What do you do? One of the things I will say first and foremost, yes, they are a sponsor of this channel, but if you use something like Thrive Market, it does help a ton. Okay, because you can toggle between keto, paleo, gluten-free, whatever. You can look at whatever diet you're doing and get groceries delivered right to your doorstep. I highly, highly, highly recommend them if you are someone that is busy and just needs like it done for you. I have shopping lists and I have my own specific keto fasting bundles and everything like that that you can check out. So if you use that link down below, you can get groceries delivered to your doorstep, save you a bunch of money by not having to drive to the grocery store, not having to get all that stuff. And a big thank you to Thrive for continuing to support this channel and being able to give all my subscribers awesome pricing, awesome specials directly through my link down below. So check them out after this video if you're looking at doing any kind of carb cycling or keto cycling. So when you're doing keto for a period of time, you start feeling really good. Your body is getting used to utilizing those ketones, and then it's time to switch off carbohydrates. Well, what can you expect? Well, one of the things that you can expect is to feel foggy for a few days. But don't rain on that parade too much, because remember when you first started keto, you felt foggy too. A lot of that fogginess and that keto flu feeling is a result of upregulated oxidative stressors and intolerance, not being able to utilize the fats very well. Then your body gets better at it. Well, then when you look at going over to the carbohydrates, well, it's the same kind of thing. Your body doesn't have the glucose metabolism tools as much. So you take a couple days to get that process going. And you also have an increase in oxidative stressors. So one of the biggest mistakes people make is they go right back into the carb world and they feel terrible, so they bounce right back to keto. So they only get like 2 days of actual carbs, and all they've done is increased a bunch of stress with no ability to actually mitigate the oxidative damage. You have to give it a solid run, which is exactly why doing like 4 days of keto along with 1 day of carbs can be very, very tough unless you're specifically implementing some fasting strategies, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I'm not as much of a fan of that as much as I am as saying, hey, dedicate 2 or 3 weeks to being able to just come off keto and go into carbohydrate mode. You really want to be sticking with relatively low glycemic carbohydrates. And you want to be leaning into what are called butyrate producing foods, okay? Foods that are going to help grow the gut microbiome as diverse as you possibly can, okay? So that's going to be things like sweet potatoes, really a phenomenal one. Things like butternut squash are another really good one. Lean into also having some artichoke and things like that just because it helps grow that gut bacteria. But the carbs that you really want to be having are going to be low inflammation carbs, okay? So things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, parsnips, things like that, versus say a bunch of white rice or a bunch of grains, at least as you introduce. Okay, this allows your body to not have this massive inflammatory spike. Okay, if we have too much of these grains and too much of these lectins right when we start, it can really send us into overload so much that our body can't adapt. So I usually like to recommend starting with the things like the sweet potatoes, the red potatoes, the white potatoes, and implementing those in a little bit. My general rule of thumb is to go more of a paleo approach, at least for the first couple of weeks when you're introducing carbs back in. Okay? And what you can expect to feel is the first week not feeling really great. Okay? But again, remember, you didn't feel great that first week of keto either. And then you need to try to work out at a little bit of a higher intensity so your body has the ability to burn through those fuels fast and develop efficiency with them. It's sort of like if you were to go over to another country to try to learn a language, but you could press a fast forward button and do everything quicker, you're going to learn it quicker. It's the same kind of thing with when you switch to a different energy store or energy source, but you can hit the fast forward button by moving quick and working out a lot, then you're rushing those nutrients in and the cell has no choice but to adapt really quick. You're just expediting the process. So I usually recommend when you go back on the carbs, increase your training intensity so your body can upregulate the utilization of that, okay? The other benefit that we have to remember is by doing it this way, our fat adaptation that we achieved by doing the ketogenic diet for 2 or 3 months at a time, well, that sticks with us for a longer period of time than glucose adaptation does. So glucose adaptation it happens relatively quick and it goes away relatively quick. Fat adaptation comes along a little bit slower, but it also goes away a little bit slower. So what that means is like all the fat adaptation benefits where our cells are used to utilizing fats, well, we get to keep those for a little while even when we're having carbohydrates. But if we started having carbohydrates for like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, we'd slowly start to lose the fat adaptation benefits and we'd have to earn them again. So our goal is to superficially get the body adjusted to using carbs, but not super internally. We want to remain keto dominant, not carb dominant. I don't see a whole lot of benefit of doing, say, 2 to 3 months carbohydrates followed by 1 month keto, like the inverse. I don't see the benefit in that since the keto process takes longer to adapt to. Okay, and that's simply because PPAR alpha and all these different receptor proteins that are involved in the signaling and the creation and the utilization of fats. So fat adaptation and carb adaptation happen at different rates. It has to do with mitochondrial biogenesis. Now, just to touch on what happens from a negative perspective, if you were to do carb cycling where you did like 4 days keto, 1 or 2 day carbs, you are constantly sitting in this phase of oxidative stress because you're not ever giving yourself a chance to adapt. Ketosis has oxidative stressors in a different world. Glucose has oxidative stressors in a different world. They're not the same, okay? So you go keto for a few days, bunch of oxidative stressors on this side. You go glucose for a couple days, a bunch of oxidative stressors in this side. Then you go back to keto, you're climbing this ladder of oxidative stress because you're never giving yourself a chance to actually adapt to the hormetic stressor. If you go a little bit longer, you allow your body ketogenic stressor and oxidative stress, and come back down. Glucose, oxidative stressor, and come back down. Keto, you're dancing this nice, delicate balance that's allowing you to adapt better versus just sending yourself in a world of inflammation and a world of oxidative stress that's going to, unless all things are perfect and your sleep is perfect and you have no stress and you're eating squeaky clean and you grow all your own food, you're going to have some damage that occurs from that. You're going to be sitting at this threshold. So carb cycling is so important and so powerful, but it also has to be done properly. Otherwise, you really put yourself into a sketchy situation. And that's what happens with people that dance this line where they do keto and then they start having little snacks here and there and they're knocking themselves out of keto all the time, not ever getting the full benefit. If you want me to do more videos on carb cycling and break it down a little bit more with specific meals and things like that, I'd love to hear your feedback. So go ahead and comment down below in the comment section. That way I can get a taste of what the content you want to see is. And as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.